Time ticks away.
In the middle of Piltover City was a well-known workshop ran by Corin Reivek. He was famous all over Runeterra for making the world's best prosthetic limbs. He'd spend a lot of time working on his prosthetics to the point where they'd become superior to the original. Eventually his daughter Orianna got to an age where she could start helping out around the workshop. So Corin took Orianna on as an apprentice and started teaching her everything he knows about making prosthetics. A couple of years would pass and Orianna would be known as a friendly-going, happy girl that is quite good in the prosthetic limb business. She had a real adventurous spirit, always wanting to leave the workshop and go exploring. But Corin feared for her safety, so he never let Orianna venture out past Piltover. Orianna based her views on the rest of the world from the stories Corin would tell her about his travels in Runeterra. But there was one place Corin would allow Orianna to go to, and that was the local theatre. Here she would find herself fascinated of all the dancers on stage. As soon as the show would finish, she would run home and make herself a figurine of the dancer she just seen. While Orianna is making a figurine of her favourite dancer, she overhears a customer talking to Corin about a chemical explosion that just happened in Zaun. The chemical explosion has made poisonous gas start flooding the streets of Zaun. Orianna goes over to Corin demanding they go down the Zaun to help everybody. But Corin doesn't allow it. He doesn't want to risk Orianna getting injured. Corin doesn't want to hear any more of it, so he sends Orianna off to her room while he gets back to work on his prosthetics. But later that night, Orianna decides to sneak out and head to Zaun herself. She is able to find her way to the Hextrolic Descender, where she would make her way into Zaun for the very first time. Though when she gets down there, she realises how bad it actually is. The whole city of Zaun has basically been destroyed. Everyone there who is still alive are using oily rags over the mouth to prevent the poisonous gas from reaching their lungs. Orianna doesn't leave though. She ends up staying in Zaun for weeks. She helps everybody build themselves a respiratory system and sets up safe zones all over Zaun so people can breathe without poisonous gas. A couple of weeks in, she finds herself coming across a kid without a mask. The kid is starting to become gravely sick, so Orianna gives her her own respiratory system. But doing this act of kindness is going to cost Orianna way more than she could ever imagine. Eventually, after helping everybody in Zaun, Orianna would head home. When arriving back home, her father Corin was not happy at all. They would argue for a little bit, but eventually Corin would be happy that his daughter just came home alive. But that was short-lived. One day, Orianna started coughing up blood. Orianna's lungs are now full of poison from giving her respiratory system to that kid. And with that, she becomes gravely sick, to the point where she's on the brink of death. Corin cannot accept this and decides to start making something he promised himself he never would. He starts to make Orianna a full set of prosthetic lungs. Weeks go by and eventually Corin finishes the lungs. Orianna is now on the verge of death, so Corin has no time. He decides he has to perform the surgery himself. Though he is sneaky about it. Inside the lungs, he has made a mechanism where she must be wound up before she can even use them. But there's a special key used to do this. So Corin uses this key to wind up Orianna just enough so she could never leave the workshop. He then puts the key in the safe while Orianna starts to wake up. The operation was successful for the time being. A couple of weeks go past and Orianna is back at work. But working on her first day, she starts to notice she's feeling quite sick. The poison has returned and this time it's targeting other organs. So Corin and Orianna decide to start making more prosthetics and replace Orianna bit by bit every time an organ gets infected. Months would go past and eventually Orianna's whole body would be swapped over to a mechanical prosthetic, where the only part remaining in her body that was human was her heart. But their plan works. They're able to save Orianna by changing her whole body. Though the operation was not cheap, they had to sell their workshop in Piltover and relocate down in Zaun. But none of them minded since Orianna was okay. For the time, both of them were happy. Over time though, Orianna would start to become disconnected from who she really was. Her memories start to feel like stories. Her creativity starts to fade. The figurines she would make of the dancers would turn out from beautiful art to a tuned mechanism. Even her perception of time was going very, very slow. Though time was going slow for Orianna, it wasn't going slow for Corin. Time was starting to catch up with him. Corin's heart would eventually start to give him problems. The years of stress have finally caught up to him. He can no longer work, so he passes down the prosthetic business to Orianna, where she would start to make the business based around her figurines instead of the prosthetics. Her figurines would start to be recognised all over Runeterra just like her father's prosthetics would. She was able to make a small fortune out of selling the figurines. So just like her father, she decides to spend all the money she made to save him instead. For her to get the items to save her father, she needed to get into contact with one of the Chem Barons. These guys have the monopoly over the whole city. They control everything that happens inside of Zaun. In their own mind, they're businessmen. One of the Chem Barons are able to offer something to Orianna that could really help. It's a Hextech gemstone. She pays the Chem Baron what he asks for and takes the gemstone back to her house. She is trying to craft something from keeping Corin's heart from failing, but the device she makes out of the gemstone has way too much power for a human heart. She needs way more time to be able to work on this. There is one other thing stopping her progress. The Chem Baron kept on returning to Orianna's house demanding more money, to where Orianna would give him her final dollar. Now she knows next time he returns it will end in violence. With no time remaining, Orianna decides there's only one more option left that is fast enough. She decides to give her own heart to her own father. With time running out, she puts Corin to sleep and does the surgery herself. She puts her own heart inside of Corin, and she puts a prosthetic heart inside herself. With Orianna giving Corin her heart, that now makes her 100% mechanical. After the operation, Orianna would stay with Corin, laying on his chest, hearing her own heartbeat through him. But she has no emotion for what's going on. She has now lost the last remaining bit of her own humanity. She now feels no fear, no remorse, just acceptance. She then breaks into the safe where Corin was keeping her key and winds herself up. And then she just leaves. A couple of days would pass and Corin would wake up. The workshop in front of him is now filled with hundreds of figurines, but there was only one that would stand out to him. It was a golden dancer that needed no key to keep herself going.